On this edition of Paint Your Engine, we're going to have a go with the Midland Railway's Lickey Banker 010, popularly known as Big Bertha. Now there's a great in-depth talk about Big Bertha from Alistair Moseley of the Bromsgrove Society on YouTube. I'll stick a link in the description for you. But if you haven't got an hour and a half, or you'd just like to watch the painting come together, or if you want something which isn't interrupted by a dog fiddling with the power supply, I'll give you a brief rundown on the engine. And for this painting, let's try and picture the engine late in the evening, which gives us an excuse to have some warm colours in the sky and silhouette the train as much as we can. The locomotive came about specifically for use on the Lickey Incline on the old Birmingham and Gloucester line, later the Midland line from Bristol to Birmingham. This 2-mile stretch of 1 in 37 was built in 1840, apparently against the advice of both George Stephenson and I.K. Brunel. A single locomotive on the front simply wasn't enough to drag a heavy train up the incline, and this being run by the Midland Railway, the engines were always underpowered. It wasn't unknown in the Johnson and Kirtley years to find an express train being hauled by a pair of 440s and then banked by a trio of 060s at the back. So that's 5 crews and 5 fuel supplies to pay out for. I wonder how the LMS racked up so much debt. Now, one thing to take into account is the location. When you look at the Lickey Incline on a map, you'll find that it doesn't run from north to south, but it runs a sort of north by northeast direction. And when the sun sets in the UK, it doesn't set completely in the west, but more sort of southwest. The sun will be set slightly out of frame as we'll be painting her from the east, looking west. So the train and the foreground, the embankment, will have just a glimmer of light on our side, but only just enough to read the typography on the engine when we come to paint it. Now, in the early 20th century, Henry Fowler gave the job of designing this engine to his draftsman, James Anderson. After delays by World War I, the 73-ton 010 emerged from Derby Works in 1919, making her the second and last 010 built in the UK. You might think that she was just a typically crude brute that the Midland desperately churned out in an attempt to keep up, but she was a little more sophisticated than that. She was a 4-cylinder compound with 2 inside cylinders driven by the same chest ports that drove the outside ones. She also had a second crank axle, not to drive any valve gear, but to clear the motion being fouled by the main crank axle. Couple these 4 cylinders with 4-foot 7.5-inch driving wheels and a huge 180 psi superheated boiler, then you have a tractive effort of 43,315 pounds. Making her more powerful than 2 Ginties. Not forgetting the permanent headlamp in front of the chimney when we come round to painting it. There's a really nice painting of Big Bertha by Roy Wilson that demonstrates how powerful the beam of the headlamp was. But before anyone watches this saying, "Your painting's rubbish, you'll never be as good as Roy's," I know, but that's not the point of this show. The point is that anyone should be able to have a go, not just those who are up to the Guild of Railway Artists standards. Now, the name Big Bertha has been applied to many things, including a golf club, a wrestler, a bell pepper, numerous German-made guns, and I think there was even a Marvel character named Big Bertha at one point. But I think rail fans will be disappointed when Disney makes that film as part of the MCU and doesn't make it around the engine. It'll be a bit like Danny Boyle's Trainspotting all over again. It's not exactly clear why the name was applied to the engine, as local enginemen simply called her the Big 'Un. There was even talk of naming her Big Emma at one point, but I think there's a restaurant in Germany who might have sued for defamation about that. What a lot of people don't realise is there's a lot about this engine that's gone down in history as fact, when actually some of it is myth. For instance, there's a theory that Big Bertha was actually designed for heavy freight. The story goes that after the First World War, Sir Henry Fowler became adamant that the Midland Railway needed a new type of heavy goods engine. So when Big Bertha emerged from Derby Works in 1919, she was tested on some heavy coal trains, but proved to be an abysmal failure. She had the power, nearly twice as much as a 4F, but not the speed. And with a wheelbase of nearly 21 feet, she couldn't really handle points unless she was crawling through them. Now, there may be some truth in the point about points. Yeah, I know, I hate that pun too. See, working as a past cleaner for BR, Bromsgrove-based Eric Underhill said that while going through the points, the engine had to be driven very carefully. But as for the story about her being a heavy freight design, that seems unlikely, because drawings for a specialist banking engine date back to 1910. and at least 4 designs were submitted, including a rigid-framed 0660 tank and a 2662 tank. In fact, if World War I hadn't happened, there's every chance that Big Bertha could have been outshopped by 1914. And to anyone who says, well, why didn't they just put a Garrett on the back? They did, but it wasn't very good. There's a really famous photograph of this engine banking the L&ER Garrett 280082 built for the Warsborough Bank up the Lickey. It was tried here a few times, and on this occasion the L&ER Garrett was banking an LMS Garrett hauling a 42-wagon goods train up the bank, and somewhere along the climb the whole train had stalled. And I would love to have been on the footplate on one of those locos because they had all that power on not even the heaviest goods train known to mankind, yet they still needed rescuing by the Midland's biggest conventional engine. Must have been pretty embarrassing for them. In fact, the Garrett was hated by Bromsgrove enginemen. One of them said it was the only engine he knew of where the injectors worked with 20 psi in the boiler, so work that one out. Unfortunately, Big Bertha wasn't entirely faultless either. Because she was a one-off, she had some one-off problems that couldn't be solved by lifting bits from other locos. The engines at Bromsgrove had to be coaled by hand, but the original tender was so high that it was virtually impossible to throw coal into it, which resulted in the tender sides being cut down in 1924. She only had 2 chests shared across 4 cylinders. Sounds simple, but if one chest wears out on a compound with 4 individual chests, then at least the pairing chest could effectively be blocked off and the engine simply converted to a simple loco to allow it to keep on running. Not recommended, of course, but then there are worse things like filling the boiler with concrete and running the engine on compressed air. But with just 2 chests supplying 4 cylinders, if one wore out, then the whole side of the engine wouldn't work anymore, and the cylinder block may have to be replaced. Thankfully though, this didn't happen, but she did have Fowler's infamous Derby axle boxes, and any LMS engineman of the 1920s will tell you how much they enjoyed failing. But right to the end of her life, enthusiasts would travel from all over the world just to see her, and even have a go on her. Lickey engineman Pat Wallace recalls giving visiting dentists from New Zealand a go on the shovel during one run. There's even reports of taking car designer Sir Alec Isigonis, the man who designed the Morris Minor and the Mini, for a ride on the engine. Sadly, being a unique one-off, Big Bertha wasn't one to fit into any regular maintenance regime with more usual designs. And when BR took control of everything, the desire to do away with anything old and complicated was paramount. She was withdrawn in May 1956, but she wasn't broken up until after the Derby Works Open Day that September, during which she was one of the most popular attractions. But all good things must come to an end. One of the excuses that was made for her withdrawal was a crack in the frames beneath the cab, but despite the claims, apparently nobody could find the crack. A more plausible reason came about in 2007. According to a representative of the London Midland Region's Inspectorate, the journals on the second crank axle were found to be worn out to scrapping size by 1956. Replacement could have been possible if the axle wasn't such a special forging, but it was a burden that British Rail simply wasn't prepared to shoulder. So with 835,331 miles on the clock, Big Bertha was broken up in 1957. All that's left of the engine today, apart from her tender plate, which is privately owned, is her British Rail smokebox number plate, a works plate, and the whistle, which sits in the Norton Collection Museum in Bromsgrove. Big Bertha's place at Bromsgrove Shed was filled by BR9F number 92079, which worked there until 1963. Regular steam banking on the Lickey ended in 1965, after 124 years. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed painting it. If you like what you see and you'd like to see more, please feel free to like, share, subscribe, discuss, contribute to Steam Locos in Profile on Patreon, and why not have a go yourself? Why not paint your engine? Oh, and word of advice, when you think you've finished your painting, don't be tempted to keep adding bits to it. You'll just ruin it, like I did.